Sarah Mitchell's black Honda CR-V rolled into the Chevron station at exactly 9:47 p.m., the digital clock on her dashboard glowing in the darkness. She'd been awake since 4:30 hours, and every muscle in her body was screaming for rest. 14 hours at the naval base had drained her in ways that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Paperwork. Endless bureaucratic paperwork. She almost laughed at the irony. She'd survived 3 combat deployments in Hell Week, but administrative duties were slowly killing her soul. The San Diego night air hit her face as she stepped out of the vehicle, cool and carrying the faint salt smell of the Pacific Ocean just a few miles away. She rolled her shoulders, feeling the knots of tension that had built up from hunching over a desk all day. Her civilian clothes, dark jeans and a fitted gray hoodie, felt strange after years of uniforms and tactical gear. That was the point, though. Blend in. Be normal. Pretend the last 8 years of her life hadn't happened. The gas station was one of those older models, the kind with flickering fluorescent lights that gave everything a slightly sickly yellow tinge. A few cars sat at the pumps, their owners inside paying or grabbing late-night snacks. Sarah noticed details automatically, a habit she couldn't turn off even when she wanted to. 2 vehicles at the pumps, one SUV with a family loading up, a sedan with a single occupant scrolling through their phone, no suspicious vehicles idling in the shadows. She pushed through the glass door, and a cheerful electronic bell chimed above her head. The young clerk behind the counter looked up and gave her a tired nod. He couldn't have been more than 22, maybe 23, with the kind of acne-scarred face that suggested he was working his way through college. His name tag read Danny. Sarah returned the nod and made her way toward the coffee station in the back corner. The store was fairly empty. A mother stood in the frozen foods aisle, holding her daughter's hand while debating ice cream flavors. The little girl, maybe 6 years old, was pleading for something with cartoon characters on the package. An elderly man in a cardigan browsed the newspaper rack near the front, squinting at headlines through thick glasses. A college-aged kid with headphones around his neck was studying energy drink options like it was a life-or-death decision. Sarah grabbed a large cup and filled it with what the label optimistically called French roast, but smelled like it had been sitting on the burner since noon. She didn't care. It was hot, caffeinated, and would keep her awake for the 20-minute drive home. She added 2 sugars more than she usually took, but exhaustion demanded extra fuel. As she turned toward the counter, contemplating whether to grab some chips or just go straight home, she caught sight of her reflection in the security mirror mounted in the corner. A 34-year-old woman with her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup, bags under her eyes from too many early mornings. Nobody looking at her would guess what she was, what she'd done. The villages she'd raided at 300 hours, the terrorists she'd helped capture, the bullets she'd dodged. That was exactly how she wanted it. Sarah grabbed a bag of trail mix from a nearby shelf. Dinner would be this and the coffee, apparently, and headed toward the register. Danny was counting out change for the elderly man, who was carefully placing coins in his wallet with shaky hands. Sarah waited patiently, sipping her coffee. It tasted as bad as it smelled, but the warmth was comforting. The bell chimed again. Sarah glanced up out of habit, her situational awareness always running in the background like software she couldn't uninstall. 2 men entered, both wearing hoodies despite the mild evening temperature. The first thing she noticed was their body language tense, purposeful, scanning the store. The second thing she noticed was the bulk under their sweatshirts, positioned at the waist. Her heart rate ticked up slightly. Could be nothing. Could be concealed carry permits, could be. Everyone on the ground, now. The first man's voice shattered the quiet store like a gunshot. He pulled a black Glock from his waistband and pointed it directly at Danny's face. The second man moved quickly to the door, flipping the lock and pulling down the shade. He had a weapon too, smaller, possibly a .38 revolver. The mother screamed and pulled her daughter close. The college kid dropped his energy drink, which hit the floor and started fizzing. The elderly man grabbed the newspaper rack to steady himself. his face going pale. Sarah's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Her mind shifted instantly into a mode she knew well. Time seemed to slow, or rather her processing speed increased. She cataloged everything in rapid succession. 2 suspects, both armed. Lead suspect agitated, possibly under the influence, pupils dilated, erratic movements. Second suspect calmer, more controlled, likely the planner. 5 civilians including herself. 1 child. 1 elderly man with possible health concerns. Exits: front door now locked. Emergency exit rear of building, likely alarmed. Security camera visible, positioned above register. Windows, front facing, visible from street but tinted. Danny's hands shot up, trembling. "Please, man, just take whatever you want. Just don't." "Shut up," the lead robber screamed, jabbing the gun toward him. "Open the register, move." Sarah slowly lowered herself to the floor along with the other customers, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. The trail mix and coffee cup were still in her hands. She set them down carefully, quietly. Her training whispered through her mind like a familiar friend. Don't be a hero. Assess the situation. Wait for the right moment. Most robberies end without violence if nobody escalates. But then she saw the lead robber's hand shaking on the weapon. She saw the wild look in his eyes. She saw Danny fumbling with the register, so terrified he couldn't get it open. And Sarah Mitchell knew, with the cold certainty of someone who'd survived combat, that this situation could go very, very wrong. She just didn't know yet that in less than 2 minutes it would be the robbers who'd wish they'd chosen a different gas station. Danny's fingers finally found the register key, and the drawer sprang open with a cheerful ding that seemed obscene in the tense silence. The lead robber shoved a backpack at him. "Fill it. Everything. Hurry up." From her position on the floor, Sarah watched Danny grab handfuls of bills with shaking hands, dropping several in his panic. The second robber stood by the door, his revolver pointed vaguely in the direction of the customers, his head swiveling between the front window and his partner. He was nervous too, Sarah noted, but controlled. He kept glancing at his watch. They were on a timeline. The mother had pulled her daughter behind her body, shielding her, whispering, "It's okay, baby, it's okay," over and over like a prayer. The little girl was crying silently, her face pressed into her mother's shoulder. The college kid lay flat on his stomach, his phone visible in his pocket. Sarah could see him calculating whether he could reach it, call 911. Don't do it, she thought. Not yet. Too risky. The elderly man concerned her most. His breathing was labored, his lips had taken on a grayish tinge, and his left hand clutched at his chest. Cardiac event, possibly. The stress of the situation was pushing his body past its limits. He needed medical attention soon, but paramedics wouldn't enter until the scene was secure. Time was not on his side. "Faster!" the lead robber screamed at Danny, and Sarah saw it clearly now. The dilated pupils, the grinding jaw, the paranoid aggression. Methamphetamine, most likely, which made him 10 times more dangerous than a rational criminal. Meth users were unpredictable, prone to sudden violence, their perception of threats wildly distorted. Danny was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he emptied the register. "That's all of it, man. I swear that's all of it." "What about the safe?" "I don't have the code. Only the manager has it, I swear to God." The robber grabbed Danny by his shirt collar and pressed the Glock against his forehead. "You think I'm stupid. You think I'm stupid." Sarah's muscles tensed. This was escalating fast. Her mind ran through scenarios. Distance to the lead robber, approximately 15 feet, too far to reach him before he could fire. Second robber, 12 feet to her right, distracted by something outside the window. Gun trained away from the civilians currently. Tactical advantage. Surprise. Nobody in this room expected a 34-year-old woman in yoga pants to be a threat. Tactical disadvantage. The child. Any move she made had to guarantee the little girl's safety. One bullet in the wrong direction and... "Wait," Danny sobbed. "Wait, there's more money in the office. In the back, please." The lead robber's eyes darted toward the back of the store. then returned to Danny, suspicious. Then those eyes scanned the room, cataloging his hostages, ensuring his control. His gaze landed on Sarah. She'd made a mistake. While the others cowered, heads down, Sarah had been watching him, observing, assessing, and he'd noticed. "You," he snarled, striding away from the counter directly toward her. "The hell are you looking at?" Sarah immediately dropped her gaze, softening her posture, trying to fade back into the role of terrified civilian. But it was too late. She'd been marked. "I said, what are you looking at?" He was standing over her now, the Glock pointed down at her head. "Nothing," Sarah said quietly, her voice deliberately small. "I'm sorry." "Get up, get up." Sarah rose slowly, hands visible, palms open. She was 5'7" and he had maybe 3 inches on her. His breath reeked of cigarettes and something chemical. His free hand grabbed her hoodie and yanked her forward, away from the other customers. "Leave her alone," the mother pleaded from the floor, immediately regretting speaking as the second robber's gun swung toward her. "Shut up! Everyone shut up!" The lead robber dragged Sarah toward the center of the store, positioning her between himself and the front windows. Using her as a shield, she realized. He was more tactical than she'd given him credit for, even through the meth haze. Sarah's training screamed at her. She was in the perfect position now, close enough to disarm him. The angle was right. His grip on her hoodie compromised his weapon stability. She could execute the technique she'd drilled 1,000 times, had used twice in actual combat situations overseas. Her muscles knew the movements so well she could do them asleep. But the child, the mother, the elderly man having a heart attack, the college kid who might panic, Danny still behind the counter, traumatized. Too many variables, too many ways it could go wrong. So Sarah waited, and breathed, and stayed calm while every civilian in the room radiated terror. The robber pressed the cold barrel of the Glock against her right temple. Sarah felt the small circle of metal, felt the slight tremor in his hand transfer through the weapon to her skin. She calculated the trigger pull weight. Glock 19s typically had a 5.5-pound trigger pull. His finger was already on the trigger, applying pressure. Maybe 3 pounds, maybe 4. 2 pounds from discharge, maybe less if his finger spasmed. "You think you're brave," he hissed in her ear. "You think you're tough, staring at me like that." "No," Sarah said calmly. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean anything." "Liar!" The gun pressed harder against her temple, and she heard the small click of the trigger moving back another fraction. 4.5 pounds now, maybe more. The store had gone absolutely silent except for the hum of the refrigerators and the elderly man's labored breathing. The second robber had stopped watching the window and was staring at his partner with growing concern. "Yo, man, we got the money. Let's just go." "Shut up, I'm handling this." But he wasn't handling anything. He was spiraling, the meth and adrenaline combining into a toxic cocktail of paranoia and aggression. Sarah had seen this before, in different contexts, different countries. This was the moment where everything either de-escalated or exploded into violence. The robber's mouth was next to her ear now, his voice dropping to something almost intimate, which was somehow more terrifying than the shouting. "You got any last words? Huh? Any last prayers before I paint this store with your brain?" Sarah's heart rate was 78 beats per minute, elevated but controlled. Her breathing was steady. Her hands were relaxed at her sides. To anyone watching, she might have seemed resigned to her fate, perhaps in shock. But inside her mind, Sarah Mitchell was running calculations at lightning speed. 7 years of training, 3 deployments, hundreds of hours on the range, thousands of hours in hand-to-hand combat drills. Scenarios exactly like this one, practiced until her body could execute them without conscious thought. She knew the exact angle needed to redirect the weapon. She knew the pressure points to strike. She knew how to control his trigger finger to prevent discharge during the disarm. She knew she could do this. The question was, should she? The robber's finger tightened another microscopic amount on the trigger, 5 pounds of pressure now, half a pound from firing, maybe less. The elderly man gasped, his hand clutching tighter at his chest. The little girl's quiet crying had stopped. She was holding her breath in terror. And Sarah Mitchell made her decision. "Last words?" she asked quietly, her voice steady as stone. The robber laughed, a harsh, manic sound. "Yeah, last words." Sarah looked directly into his dilated, bloodshot eyes and spoke 2 words that would haunt him for years to come. Wrong choice. 7 years earlier, Sarah Mitchell had stood on a beach in Coronado, California, at 400 hours on a Monday morning that would change her life forever. The Pacific Ocean roared in the darkness behind her, and before her stood an instructor whose face she couldn't fully see in the dim pre-dawn light. What she could see was his silhouette, arms crossed, radiating an aura of complete authority. "You think you belong here?" he'd asked, his voice cutting through the sound of waves. Sarah had been the only woman in a line of 63 candidates that morning. 18 women had started the training cycle. By that Monday, she was the last one remaining. The others had quit during the first week, during the endless physical training sessions, the cold water immersions, the psychological pressure designed to break anyone who wasn't absolutely committed. "Yes, instructor," Sarah had replied, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "We'll see," he'd said, and then Hell Week had begun. Now, with a gun pressed to her temple in a San Diego gas station, Sarah's mind flashed back to that training. Not out of fear, but out of preparation. Because every second of Hell Week had been designed for exactly this kind of moment. When your body was exhausted, your mind was stressed, and you had to perform perfectly or people died. She remembered the second night of Hell Week, when they'd been in the ocean for hours, the water temperature 58 degrees, her core temperature dropping into dangerous territory. Hypothermia was setting in. Several candidates were already showing signs of confusion, the first stage before unconsciousness. The instructors had been watching, waiting to see who would quit, who would ring the bell that sat on the beach, signaling their surrender. Sarah's teeth had been chattering so hard she thought they might crack. Her fingers were numb. Her legs felt like lead. The candidate next to her, a guy named Martinez who'd made it through the first year of training with her, had looked at her with glazed eyes. "I can't feel my feet," he'd whispered. "Then don't think about your feet," Sarah had whispered back. "Think about why you're here." Martinez had quit 30 minutes later. Sarah had stayed in the water for another 2 hours. Her father had been a Navy SEAL in Vietnam, one of the original frogmen who'd conducted underwater demolitions and reconnaissance missions in rivers filled with enemy soldiers. He'd never pushed her toward the military. In fact, he discouraged it. "It's not about being tough enough," he'd told her when she'd first mentioned enlisting. "It's about being willing to suffer longer than anyone else, to keep going when every part of your body is screaming at you to stop." She'd looked at him, a man who'd survived 3 tours in a war that had broken countless others, and said, "You did it." "I did," he'd agreed. "And it cost me things you can't see. You sure you want to pay that price?" Sarah had been sure. Or at least, she'd thought she was sure until she was actually in Bud's training, discovering that her father had understated the difficulty by a factor of 10. The third day of Hell Week, they'd done log PT, physical training with telephone poles that weighed over 200 pounds. 6-person teams had to carry, lift, and press these logs through various exercises while instructors screamed in their faces. Sarah's team had included 5 men, all of whom outweighed her by 50 to 80 pounds. The instructors had made it clear, if the team failed, everyone failed. During overhead presses, Sarah's shoulders had felt like they were tearing apart. The wood had been rough, cutting into her skin. Blood had mixed with ocean water and sand, creating a paste that made everything worse. One of her teammates, a guy named Jackson who'd been vocal about women not belonging in special operations, had been struggling. "I got it," Sarah had grunted, shifting her position to take more of the weight. Jackson had looked at her, surprised, and then nodded. They'd finished the exercise. Later, during a brief rest period, he'd approached her. "I was wrong about you," he'd said simply. "I know," Sarah had replied, and they'd both managed exhausted smiles. Only 18 candidates from the original 63 had made it through Hell Week. Sarah had been one of them. The other woman who'd started the cycle with her had quit on day 4, leaving Sarah as the only female candidate. The media had wanted to make a big deal about it, but the Navy had shut that down fast. In Bud S, you weren't male or female. You were either capable or you weren't. The real test had come during her first deployment to Afghanistan. Her SEAL team had been tasked with raiding a compound suspected of housing a high-value target, an IED manufacturer responsible for attacks that had killed dozens of coalition forces. The intelligence had been time-sensitive. They'd had a 4-hour window. The insertion had gone smoothly, their helicopter dropping them 2 clicks from the target. The approach had been textbook. But when they'd breached the compound, everything had gone sideways. The target wasn't alone. He'd had 8 armed fighters with him, and they'd been ready for a fight. Sarah had been third through the door. The room had erupted in gunfire. Her team leader had taken a round to his body armor, knocking him down. The second operator had engaged 2 fighters to the left. Sarah had seen a third fighter emerging from a doorway, raising an AK-47 toward her downed team leader. She'd fired twice. Center mass. The fighter had dropped. Her team leader had lived. They'd captured the target and extracted without further casualties. Later, during the debrief, her team leader, a veteran with 15 years in special operations, had looked at her with newfound respect. "You didn't freeze," he'd said. "No, instructor," Sarah had replied, using his Bud S title out of habit. "I didn't." "Don't call me instructor anymore," he'd said, extending his hand. "Call me Mike. You earned it." That had been 5 years ago. Since then, Sarah had completed 2 more deployments. She'd been in firefights, survived mortar attacks, conducted high-risk raids in the dead of night. She'd seen teammates wounded, had carried a wounded operator 300 meters under fire, had made split-second decisions that meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the ability to function despite it. She'd learned that training didn't make you fearless, it made you competent. And competence, repeated 10,000 times, became instinct. Now standing in a gas station with a Glock pressed to her temple, Sarah felt that instinct take over. Her heart rate was steady. Her breathing was controlled. Her mind was clear. The robber was still waiting for her last words, his finger millimeters from firing. He thought he held all the power in this moment. He thought she was just another victim, another civilian who would beg for her life. He had no idea that the woman he was pointing a gun at had been trained by the best special operations force in the world. That she'd survived situations far more dangerous than this. That she'd been preparing for this exact moment for 7 years. Sarah's muscles coiled ready. Her eyes tracked the gun's position, the robber's stance, his finger placement. She calculated angles, force vectors, timing. And then, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, Sarah Mitchell stopped being a victim and became what she'd always been, a weapon. The training was over. Now came the test. Time didn't actually slow down. Sarah knew that intellectually. But her perception of it changed, the way it always did when her training kicked into high gear. The world seemed to shift into a different gear, her mind processing information at a speed that made seconds feel like minutes. The robber's finger rested on the Glock's trigger. Sarah could feel the slight vibration of his hand through the barrel pressed against her temple. 5¼ pounds of pressure, she estimated. The Glock 19's trigger typically broke at 5½ pounds. He was 3/4 of the way to firing. One nervous twitch, one startled reaction, and the gun would discharge. 3 seconds. That's what she had. 3 seconds before his paranoia or impatience tipped him over the edge and he pulled that trigger the rest of the way, either intentionally or accidentally. 3 seconds to assess, decide, and act. First second assessment. Sarah's eyes moved without her head moving, taking in every detail of the environment with the systematic precision that had been drilled into her during thousands of hours of training. The second robber stood at the door, 12 feet away at her 4 o'clock position. His revolver, she could see now it was a Smith & Wesson .38 Special 5-shot cylinder, was pointed generally toward the customers on the floor, but his attention was divided. He kept glancing at his watch, then at his partner, then at the street outside. Nervous energy. He wanted to leave. He hadn't signed up for executions, just a quick robbery. That made him either an asset or a liability, depending on how this played out. The customers. The mother had her daughter completely shielded now, her body curved over the little girl like armor. Good maternal instinct, but it meant she couldn't move quickly if Sarah needed the floor clear. The college kid was still flat on his stomach, but his phone was now partially visible in his hand. He'd managed to pull it out. Was he recording, calling 911? Either way, it was both helpful and dangerous. If the robbers noticed, they might panic. The elderly man was her greatest concern. His breathing had become more labored, his skin color worse. Classic signs of myocardial infarction, a heart attack. His left arm was now completely clutched against his chest. He had minutes, maybe, before this became critical. Every second this situation continued reduced his chances of survival. Danny the clerk remained behind the counter, frozen in shock, the backpack full of money clutched in his hands. His eyes were fixed on Sarah and the gun at her head, his face white as paper. Poor kid was probably going to need therapy after this. The physical space. The security camera in the corner was still recording, its small red light blinking steadily. Good. Evidence. The front door was locked, shade drawn. The emergency exit at the rear of the store near the bathrooms, she'd clocked it when she came in, was approximately 25 feet away. No alarm sounding yet, which meant the robbers had either disabled it or it was broken. The windows facing the street were tinted, making it hard for anyone outside to see in clearly, especially with the fluorescent lighting creating glare on the glass. No police sirens yet. Nobody outside seemed aware of what was happening inside. They were isolated, at least for now. Second calculation. Sarah's mind ran through scenarios with the cold efficiency of a computer. If she did nothing, the robber would likely pull the trigger. She could see it in his eyes, the meth-fueled paranoia, the aggressive posturing, the need to prove dominance. He'd asked for last words not as a theatrical gesture but as a commitment device. He'd backed himself into a corner rhetorically. To back down now would mean losing face in front of his partner, and men like this couldn't tolerate that. Scenario probability. 85% chance he fires if she doesn't act. If she acted and failed, the gun would definitely fire. A botched disarm attempt would cause his finger to spasm on the trigger. The bullet would enter her skull at a slight angle, likely killing her instantly or leaving her with catastrophic brain damage. Scenario probability. 100% chance of death if disarm fails. If she acted and succeeded, she could control the weapon, neutralize the primary threat. But the second robber would react. How fast? Would he fire? Would he flee? Would he try to help his partner? Too many variables. She needed to account for all of them. Sarah ran through the disarm technique in her mind. Step 1. Redirect the muzzle away from her head while controlling his trigger finger to prevent discharge. Step 2. Strip the weapon from his grip using rotational force against his thumb, the weakest point of his grip. Step 3. Create distance and control, using his own body as a shield against the second robber. She'd practiced this exact sequence 10,000 times, maybe more. In training facilities, in shoot houses, in role-playing scenarios with instructors who actively tried to make her fail. Her success rate in training had been 96%, but training wasn't real life. Training didn't include meth-addled robbers with twitchy trigger fingers. Still, 96% was better than the 15% chance she had if she did nothing. The math was simple: act or die. Third second, decision point. This was the moment Sarah's father had told her about years ago when she'd asked him about combat. You can train all you want, he'd said, but there's always a moment when you have to decide. And in that moment, all your training, all your preparation, all your confidence, it comes down to one choice. Do you trust yourself enough to act? Sarah thought about the little girl pressed against her mother's shoulder, crying silently. She thought about the elderly man having a heart attack, who needed paramedics that wouldn't come until this situation was resolved. She thought about Danny, barely out of college, who'd probably taken this gas station job to pay tuition and didn't deserve to watch someone die in front of him. She thought about every mile she'd run during Bud's training, every freezing hour in the ocean, every log press that had torn her shoulders, every live fire drill, every deployment, every mission, every moment of suffering and doubt and determination. It had all been preparing her for this, right here, right now. The robber's breath was hot against her ear, waiting for her response to his demand for last words. His finger maintained that deadly pressure on the trigger, 5¼ pounds, 5½ pounds, she couldn't tell anymore. Any second now, it would cross the threshold. Sarah took one slow breath, filling her lungs with air, oxygenating her blood for the explosive burst of action to come. Her muscles were relaxed but ready, like a coiled spring. Her mind was clear, focused on the singular task ahead. She calculated one final detail: the gun's position, currently pressed against her right temple at approximately a 15-degree angle. When she moved, she needed to redirect it at least 45 degrees away from her head, preferably 60 or more. Anything less and the muzzle blast alone could cause damage even if the bullet missed. Her left hand hung naturally at her side, positioned perfectly for the initial strike. Her right hand was slightly forward, ready to control the weapon once she stripped it. Her feet were shoulder-width apart, balanced, ready to pivot. Everything was in position, every variable accounted for, every probability calculated. The robber's voice came again, impatient now, aggressive. "I said, do you have any last words?" Sarah's eyes focused on a point in the middle distance, the way they'd taught her in sniper training. Soft focus. See everything, fixate on nothing. Be aware without being distracted. She spoke calmly, her voice steady. Wrong choice. The robber's confusion lasted exactly 0.4 seconds. She could see it in his eyes. The momentary processing delay as his meth-addled brain tried to make sense of her words. And in that 0.4-second window, Sarah Mitchell moved. The 3-second war was over. The real war was just beginning. Sarah's left hand snapped upward with the speed of a striking snake, her palm striking the robber's wrist at the precise angle needed to redirect the gun's barrel away from her head. Simultaneously, her right hand shot up and wrapped around his trigger finger, isolating it, preventing it from completing its pull. The entire movement took less than half a second. The Glock's muzzle moved 47 degrees to the right, away from Sarah's temple. The robber's finger, trapped in Sarah's grip, couldn't complete the trigger pull despite his confused attempt. For a fraction of a second, his drug-addled brain couldn't process what was happening. One moment he'd been in control, the next his weapon was being redirected by a woman he'd assumed was helpless. Then his instincts kicked in, and he tried to wrench the gun back toward her. Too late. Sarah had already begun the second phase of the disarm. Her left hand maintained control of his wrist while her right hand rotated the Glock clockwise, levering it against his thumb, the weakest point of his grip. The human thumb can only withstand about 15 pounds of pressure before losing its grip. Sarah applied 30. The gun began to separate from his hand. That's when he panicked and squeezed the trigger hard. The Glock fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, a sharp crack that made everyone in the store flinch. The mother screamed. The little girl shrieked. Danny dropped to the floor behind the counter. The bullet punched through the ceiling tile, sending a shower of white dust down on them. But Sarah maintained her grip, her face focused, her movements precise. She'd trained for exactly this, for weapons discharges during disarmament. The sound didn't distract her. The spray of debris didn't distract her. Nothing existed except the weapon and the threat. She completed the rotation, and the Glock tore free from the robber's hand. The weapon flipped through the air, and Sarah deliberately let it go, sending it skittering across the tile floor toward the far corner of the store, away from everyone, away from the second robber, away from any grasping hands. The first robber stood there for a half-second, staring at his empty hand in disbelief. Sarah didn't give him time to recover. She pivoted on her left foot, stepping behind him while simultaneously grabbing his right arm and yanking it behind his back in a standing arm lock. The angle was severe, his shoulder joint stressed to its limit. She applied pressure, not enough to dislocate, but enough to send white-hot pain shooting through his arm and shoulder. The robber screamed and dropped to his knees. Sarah went with him, maintaining the lock, using her body weight and positioning to keep him controlled. In 3 seconds, she'd gone from hostage to captor. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order delivered with the full weight of someone who'd given orders under enemy fire, someone who expected immediate compliance. The second robber, who'd been standing at the door in shock, suddenly snapped back to awareness. His partner was on the ground, screaming. The woman they'd thought was just another victim had just disarmed a loaded weapon like it was nothing. His eyes went wide, and his .38 special swung up toward Sarah. But Sarah had already positioned the first robber between herself and his partner, using him as a human shield. She was crouched behind him, presenting minimal target, her hand maintaining the painful arm lock. "Gun down," Sarah said, her voice level calm. "Now." The second robber's hands were shaking, his revolver wavering. He was looking at his partner, looking at Sarah, trying to process what to do. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This was supposed to be easy, a quick robbery, in and out, nobody gets hurt. "I will break his arm," Sarah continued, her tone matter of fact. "Then I will come for you. You have 3 seconds to put that weapon on the ground." She wasn't bluffing, and somehow, the second robber knew it. There was something in her voice, in her posture, in the absolute confidence of her movements that told him she'd done this before, that she was capable of everything she threatened and more. 1. The second robber's eyes darted to the door. Could he run? Should he run? 2. His partner was still screaming, my arm, Jesus Christ, my arm." 3. The revolver hit the floor with a metallic clatter. "Kick it away from you," Sarah ordered. The second robber kicked the gun, sending it spinning across the tile to join the Glock in the corner. Then he raised his hands, all the fight draining out of him. "On the ground, face down, hands behind your head, do it now." He complied, dropping to his knees and then prone, hands lacing behind his head. His whole body was shaking. Sarah's heart rate was 89 beats per minute, elevated but still controlled. Her breathing was steady. The adrenaline was there, she could feel it, the familiar rush that came with combat, but it didn't control her. She controlled it. "Everyone okay?" she called out, her eyes never leaving the 2 robbers. The mother was sobbing, clutching her daughter. "We're okay, we're okay." The college kid raised his head, his phone in his hand, screen lit. "I called 911. Police are coming." "Good," Sarah said. "Keep them on the line. Tell them 2 suspects disarmed, situation under control." Danny peered over the counter, his face pale. Holy shit, what, who?" "Danny," Sarah interrupted calmly. "I need zip ties, the kind you use to bundle newspapers. You have any?" Yeah, in the supply closet." "Get them, bring me at least 4. Danny scrambled to comply, disappearing into the back room. Sarah looked at the elderly man who was still sitting against the newspaper rack, his breathing labored. "Sir, what's your name?" "Harold," he managed, his voice weak. "Harold, paramedics are coming. You're going to be okay. Just keep breathing nice and slow. Help is on the way." Harold nodded weakly, his hand still pressed against his chest. The first robber was still on his knees, whimpering in pain. Sarah maintained the arm lock with just enough pressure to keep him compliant without causing permanent damage. She'd been trained in pain compliance techniques, how to control someone through joint manipulation without crossing the line into unnecessary brutality. "What's your name?" she asked him quietly. "Kyle," he gasped. "Jesus, you're breaking my arm." "I'm not breaking anything, Kyle, but if you try to move, that will change. Understand?" Yes, okay, just." Danny returned with a handful of zip ties, his hands still shaking. Sarah talked him through the process, instructing him to secure the second robber's hands behind his back first, then his ankles. The college kid, who introduced himself as Marcus, helped, his phone still connected to 911 dispatch. Once the second robber was secured, Sarah carefully transitioned Kyle from the arm lock to a prone position, zip-tying his wrists and then his ankles with practiced efficiency. The heavy-duty ties clicked shut with finality. Only then, with both threats neutralized and secured, did Sarah allow herself to stand up fully. She rolled her shoulders, feeling the tension release. Her hands were completely steady. In the distance, sirens began to wail, growing closer. The whole thing, from the moment she'd moved to disarm Kyle until both robbers were zip-tied on the floor, had taken 63 seconds. Just over a minute. Sarah looked at her hands. No shakes, no tremors, just like training. Because that's all this had been, training put into practice. The first police cruiser arrived 3 minutes and 47 seconds later, lights strobing red and blue through the tinted windows. 2 officers burst through the door, weapons drawn, shouting commands that echoed off the tile floors. "Hands, let me see your hands." Sarah immediately raised her hands, stepping away from the zip-tied robbers, making herself non-threatening. "2 suspects secured on the ground," she called out calmly. "No outstanding threats. 1 civilian needs medical attention, possible cardiac event." The lead officer, a veteran with gray at his temples and the careful movements of someone who'd seen too many situations go sideways, swept the room with his weapon, assessing. His eyes took in the scene. 2 men zip-tied on the floor, a Glock and revolver in the far corner, a woman with her hands up speaking with absolute composure, and several terrified civilians starting to emerge from their protective positions. "Who secured the suspects?" the officer asked, his weapon lowering slightly. "I did," Sarah said. The officer's eyes narrowed, taking in Sarah's appearance. Yoga pants, gray hoodie, ponytail, no visible weapons or equipment. She looked like someone who'd stopped for coffee on the way home from the gym, not someone who just disarmed 2 armed robbers. "Ma'am, I need you to step over here and keep your hands visible." Sarah complied without argument, moving to where the officer indicated. She understood the protocol. Until they sorted out who was who and what had happened, everyone was a potential threat. The second officer was already checking on Harold, calling for paramedics to expedite. More police arrived, then paramedics. The small gas station became a chaos of personnel, radios crackling, cameras flashing as officers documented the scene. The Glock and revolver were photographed in place, then carefully collected as evidence. Kyle and his partner, whose name turned out to be Derek, were searched, their zip ties replaced with official handcuffs, their rights read. A detective arrived, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s named Rodriguez. She separated the witnesses, taking preliminary statements. When she got to Sarah, her notepad ready, she asked the standard opening question. "Can you tell me what happened here tonight?" Sarah gave a clear, concise account. No embellishment, no dramatization, just facts. The robbers entered, demanded money. Kyle became agitated and separated her from the group, pressed a weapon to her head. She disarmed him, secured both suspects, rendered aid to the cardiac patient. Rodriguez's pen stopped moving. You disarmed him, a man pointing a gun at your head. Yes, ma'am. And you have training in this area. Sarah paused. This was the moment. She could downplay it, could be vague, could avoid the conversation entirely. But the security footage would tell the truth anyway, and these officers deserved to know what they were dealing with. She reached slowly into her pocket, pulling out her military ID, and handed it to Detective Rodriguez. Rodriguez looked at the ID and her eyebrows rose. She looked at Sarah, then back at the ID, then at Sarah again. I'd appreciate it if my identity could be protected, Sarah said quietly. Operational security. Rodriguez nodded slowly, understanding immediately. She'd worked enough cases involving military personnel to know that some identities needed to stay quiet. Understood, but I'll need a full statement. Of course. Sarah was taken to the police station, where she spent the next 2 hours giving a detailed statement in an interview room. She walked Detective Rodriguez through every moment, every decision point, every action. The detective listened, occasionally asking clarifying questions, her respect for Sarah growing with each answer. The weapon discharged during the disarm, Rodriguez noted. That could have gone very badly. Yes, Sarah agreed. But the alternative, waiting and hopping he didn't fire intentionally, had a much higher probability of civilian casualties, including a 6-year-old girl. Rodriguez nodded. For what it's worth, I think you saved lives tonight, including Harold's. The paramedics said another 5 minutes and he might not have made it. Sarah didn't respond. She didn't do it for recognition. She'd done it because she was there, because she was trained, because standing by while people died wasn't in her DNA. Her commanding officer arrived an hour later, a Navy captain who looked simultaneously proud and exasperated. Mitchell, he said when they were alone in a private room, you just became the most popular training video in special warfare. Sorry. The gas station's security footage. It's already been entered into evidence, which means it's going to leak, probably within 72 hours. He ran a hand through his hair. Public affairs is going to have a field day with this. Can't they suppress it? We'll try. We'll blur your face, redact your name. But Sarah, you just disarmed an armed robber on camera with textbook SEAL technique. Every military forum on the internet is going to be analyzing this frame by frame. Some of them will figure it out. He was right, of course. By the next morning, the footage was on Reddit. By that afternoon, it was on Twitter. By evening, it had been picked up by local news. The headlines were sensational. Mystery woman disarms armed robber. Civilian hero stops gas station robbery. Incredible security footage shows lightning-fast disarm. The Navy's Public Affairs Office released a carefully worded statement. We can confirm that one of our personnel intervened during a robbery attempt in San Diego. We are proud of all our sailors and the training that enabled this individual to act decisively to protect civilian lives. Due to operational security considerations, we cannot release the individual's identity or specific unit assignment. That statement only fueled more speculation. Military analysts on news programs broke down the technique, pointing out the precision, the control, the obvious advanced training. This isn't something you learn in a weekend self-defense class, one retired SEAL told a reporter. This is hundreds of hours of training, possibly thousands. This person is military or law enforcement, and my money's on special operations. The video went viral. Within 3 days, it had been viewed 18 million times. TikTok was flooded with people attempting to recreate the disarm technique, which horrified Sarah when she saw it, because they were doing it wrong and were going to hurt themselves. YouTube channels analyzed every frame. Reddit threads debated her identity, her training, her background. Sarah watched all of this unfold from her apartment, her phone blowing up with messages from teammates, from former instructors, from friends she hadn't heard from in years. Her father called from Florida. "Saw the news," he said simply. "Dad, You did good, Sarah, real good. Your mother would have been proud." Sarah felt her throat tighten. Her mother had died when Sarah was 16, long before the Navy, before Bud S., before any of this. "Thanks, Dad." "You okay?" "Yeah," she said, looking at her hands. The same hands that had disarmed Kyle, that had maintained control, that had secured two armed men without causing permanent injury. "Yeah, I'm okay." Kyle and Derek made their first court appearance. Kyle's public defender attempted to argue that his client had been the victim of excessive force. The judge asked to see the security footage. After watching it, the judge denied bail. "Your client pointed a loaded weapon at an unarmed woman's head and threatened to kill her," the judge said flatly. "The fact that she was capable of defending herself doesn't make her the aggressor." Bail denied. In his holding cell, Kyle told his cellmate the story. "I thought she was just some regular person, you know, like a soccer mom or whatever. How was I supposed to know?" His cellmate, a career criminal with 2 decades of experience, laughed darkly. "Man, you picked the wrong person to mess with. That's gonna follow you forever. You're the guy who got beat by a girl." Kyle didn't respond, but in his mind he kept replaying those 2 words she'd said right before everything went sideways. Wrong choice. He'd never forget them. The media requests started within hours of the story breaking. Sarah's phone number, somehow obtained despite the Navy's attempts to protect her identity, rang constantly. Voicemails piled up from morning show producers, documentary filmmakers, podcast hosts, and magazine writers. Everyone wanted the exclusive. Everyone wanted to tell her story. Sarah ignored them all. She went to work at the naval base every day, enduring the knowing looks from colleagues who'd figured out it was her. Nobody said anything directly. Operational security was taken seriously, but the sideways glances and subtle nods told her they knew. Her team members were more direct, sending her memes and jokes in their private group chat. One message simply read, "Most expensive cup of coffee in history," with a gif of someone doing a dramatic action movie disarm. Another, "Next time just use DoorDash." Sarah appreciated the humor. It kept things normal when everything felt surreal. But the attention wouldn't die down. If anything, it intensified. A former SEAL, retired and no longer bound by the same restrictions, went on a popular podcast and said, "I can't tell you who it was, but I can tell you that level of skill doesn't come from basic training. That's special operations, period. And if it's who I think it is, that person is a complete badass." The speculation narrowed. Amateur internet detectives started compiling lists of women in naval special warfare, cross-referencing with the San Diego area, trying to identify her. The Navy pushed back, issuing stern warnings about privacy violations and harassment, but the genie was out of the bottle. Finally, after 2 weeks of relentless media pressure, Sarah agreed to one interview. Just one. With a veteran-focused publication that promised to protect her identity and focus on the broader issues rather than sensationalizing the incident. The interview took place in a nondescript office, Sarah sitting in a chair with her back to the camera, her face completely obscured. Her voice was altered electronically, given a slightly lower pitch that made it unrecognizable. The interviewer, a former Marine, approached the conversation with respect rather than spectacle. "Why did you agree to this interview?" he asked. "Because the conversation became about me," Sarah said, her altered voice steady. "And it shouldn't be. It should be about preparation, about training, about the fact that situations like this can be resolved without loss of life if the right person is in the right place at the right time. Walk me through your decision-making process that night." Sarah leaned forward slightly. I assessed the threat level, the probability of violence, the risk to civilians. There was a child in that store, an elderly man having a heart attack. If I did nothing, people were going to die. If I acted, I had a chance to prevent that. You make it sound simple. The decision was simple. The execution was just training. I've disarmed weapons hundreds of times in controlled environments. This was just applying that training to a real-world scenario. But you could have been killed. Yes, Sarah acknowledged. But that was always a possibility in my line of work. We train to minimize risk, but we can't eliminate it. Every operator knows that when they sign up. The interviewer shifted topics. There's been a lot of discussion about women in special operations since this incident. How do you feel about that? Sarah was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Gender didn't disarm those robbers. Training did. Years of training. Thousands of hours of repetition until the movements became instinctive. That's what made the difference, not whether I'm male or female. But as one of the few women in naval special warfare. I don't want to be a symbol, Sarah interrupted, her voice firm. I don't want to be the woman who did X. I want to be judged on my capabilities, my performance, my results. Every operator in special operations, regardless of gender, wants the same thing, to be evaluated on merit, not on optics. Do you think this incident will change perceptions about women in combat roles? I hope it changes perceptions about preparation, Sarah said. About the importance of training, about taking self-defense seriously, about not underestimating people based on appearance. If someone takes away from this that they should get proper training, that they should prepare for emergencies, that they should never assume they know someone's capabilities just by looking at them, then it was worth it. The interview lasted 45 minutes. When it aired, it went viral, but in a different way than the security footage. People responded to Sarah's humility, her focus on training rather than heroics, her deflection of personal glory back to the fundamentals. One comment on the article read, "This is what a real professional sounds like. No ego, just competence." Another, "My daughter asked me who the woman in the interview was. I told her it doesn't matter who she is. What matters is she was prepared when it counted." But not everyone was supportive. Some commenters questioned whether she'd used excessive force. Others claimed the whole thing was staged. A few suggested she'd been reckless, that she should have just complied with the robbers' demands. Sarah read those comments once, then never again. She'd learned long ago that you couldn't control how people perceived your actions. You could only control the actions themselves. Meanwhile, Kyle and Derek's legal proceedings continued. Kyle's defense attorney tried to use Sarah's military background against her, arguing that his client couldn't have known he was threatening someone with advanced combat training, that he'd been set up to fail. The prosecutor's response was devastating. "Your client chose to commit armed robbery. He chose to separate my client's victim from the other hostages. He chose to put a gun to her head and threaten to kill her. The fact that she was capable of defending herself doesn't make her responsible for his choices. If anything, it demonstrates exactly why civilians need protection from armed criminals, because most people don't have the training or ability to defend themselves the way she did." The judge agreed. Kyle received 12 years, Derek got 8. At the sentencing, the prosecutor asked Sarah if she wanted to make a victim impact statement. Sarah declined. She had nothing to say to them. They'd made their choices. Now they'd live with the consequences. But the mother from the gas station did make a statement. She stood in the courtroom, her daughter beside her, and spoke directly to the judge. "That woman saved my daughter's life," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know who she is, I don't know her name, but I will never forget what she did. My daughter is 6 years old. She has her whole life ahead of her because someone was brave enough and skilled enough to act when it mattered." Sarah watched from the back of the courtroom, maintaining her anonymity. When the mother finished and turned to leave, their eyes met for just a moment. The mother mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Sarah nodded once, then slipped out before anyone could approach her. 6 months after the gas station incident, Sarah Mitchell stood in front of a classroom at the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility in Coronado. 23 faces looked back at her, 20 men and 3 women, all of them candidates who'd survived the initial phases of Bud-S training and were now in the advanced tactical portion of their instruction. On the screen behind her was a grainy, frozen frame from security camera footage. Even with her face blurred, even with the timestamp redacted, Sarah recognized the moment. It was the split second before she'd moved, when Kyle's gun was still pressed to her temple, when she'd made the decision to act. "This is a real-world scenario encountered by one of our personnel," Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority of experience. "We're going to break down the decision-making process, the tactical execution, and the aftermath. Pay attention. This isn't Hollywood. This is what happens when training meets reality." She clicked to the next frame, showing the beginning of the disarm sequence. First question, should this person have acted at all? Who wants to take that? A hand went up, one of the female candidates, a woman named Tors who reminded Sarah of herself 6 years ago. Determined, focused, relentless. "Depends on the threat assessment, ma'am," Tors said. "If the probability of violence was high and there were civilian lives at risk, action could be justified." "Good," Sarah said. "Now let's talk probability. What factors would indicate high risk of violence?" For the next 90 minutes, she walked them through every detail. The robber's behavior patterns indicating drug influence, the presence of a child, the elderly man having a cardiac event, the weapon's position and the trigger pressure, the timing, the angles, the risks of action versus inaction. She didn't tell them it was her. She didn't need to. Some of them had probably figured it out. The incident had been all over the news, and there weren't many female SEAL operators in San Diego. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the lesson. "The disarm technique you see here," Sarah said, highlighting the sequence frame by frame, "is one you've all practiced hundreds of times. But notice the control. Notice how the weapon is immediately directed away from the head, how the trigger finger is isolated, how the body positioning creates a shield against the secondary threat. This isn't luck. This is muscle memory built through repetition." After class, Tors approached her, hesitating slightly before speaking. "Ma'am, that gas station incident, that was you, wasn't it?" Sarah looked at the young woman, seeing the same hunger for excellence she'd once felt. She neither confirmed nor denied. What matters isn't who it was. What matters is that when the moment came, training made the difference. Every hour you spend on the range, every repetition that feels pointless, every drill that seems excessive, it's all building toward the day when it counts. Tors nodded slowly. "I want to be that ready." "Then you will be," Sarah said. "Keep showing up, keep training, keep pushing through when it gets hard. That's all any of us can do." Tors walked away, standing a little taller, and Sarah felt a familiar sense of purpose. This was why she'd transitioned to training, not just to teach techniques, but to prepare the next generation for moments they couldn't predict but needed to survive. That evening, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her apartment. She opened the door to find Harold, the elderly man from the gas station, standing in the hallway with a small gift bag in his hands. "Mr. Henderson," Sarah said, surprised. She'd met him once briefly at the hospital after the incident, but they hadn't spoken since. "I hope you don't mind," Harold said, his voice stronger than it had been that night. "I tracked you down through the veteran networks, had to call in a few favors, but I needed to thank you properly." Sarah invited him in, and Harold sat on her couch, looking around at the sparse apartment. Few decorations, mostly functional furniture, a life built around purpose rather than comfort. "The doctors said I was minutes away from a major coronary event," Harold said. "If that situation had lasted any longer, I wouldn't have made it. You ended it fast enough that the paramedics got to me in time." He paused, his eyes misting. My granddaughter graduated from college last month. I was there. I got to see it because of you." "You would have thanked any paramedic or doctor," Sarah said quietly. "I just did what I was trained to do." "No," Harold insisted. "You did more than that. You made a choice. You could have stayed down, stayed quiet, stayed safe, but you didn't. You put yourself at risk for people you didn't know." He handed her the gift bag. "This was my father's. He was Navy too, World War II. I think he'd want you to have it." Sarah opened the bag and pulled out a vintage Navy pocket watch, the metal worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside the cover was an inscription, "Fair winds and following seas." "Mr. Henderson, I can't." "You can," Harold said firmly. "And you will, because you gave me something I can never repay: time. Time with my family. Time to say the things that matter. That watch represents time, and time is the most valuable thing any of us have." After Harold left, Sarah sat holding the watch, feeling its weight in her palm. She thought about time, about the 3 seconds she'd had to make a decision, about the years of training that had prepared her for those 3 seconds, about the lifetime of moments that training had preserved. The next day, a letter arrived from Danny, the gas station clerk. He'd written to thank her and to let her know he'd enrolled in a criminal justice program. "I want to help people the way you did," he wrote. "I don't know if I'll ever be as brave as you, but I'm going to try." Sarah kept the letter. She kept Harold's watch. She kept the memes from her teammates, small reminders of that night and everything that came after. But mostly, she kept training. Because 3 weeks after her classroom lecture, Sarah was running at 5:30 hours on the beach at Coronado, the same beach where she'd started Bud S 7 years ago. The sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Her breath came in steady rhythms, her feet hitting the sand in a familiar cadence. Another woman jogged past her, heading the opposite direction, probably one of the new candidates, getting extra conditioning work before the day's official training began. Sarah recognized the determination in the woman's pace, the set of her shoulders. Sarah turned around and caught up to her. "Mind if I join you?" The woman looked over, startled, then recognized Sarah from the training facility. "Ma'am, of course not." They ran in silence for a while, the ocean waves providing rhythm. Finally, the younger woman spoke. "Can I ask you something, ma'am?" "Go ahead." "That night at the gas station, were you scared?" Sarah thought about the question. She could give the easy answer, the professional answer, the answer that made her seem invincible. But this woman deserved the truth. "Yes," Sarah said. "I was scared. Fear is information. It tells you the stakes, the risks, what you stand to lose. The question isn't whether you feel fear. The question is whether you let it paralyze you or use it to sharpen your focus." "How do you do that? Use it instead of freeze?" "Practice," Sarah said simply. "You practice until your body knows what to do even when your mind is screaming. You practice until the movements are so ingrained that they happen automatically. You practice until confidence isn't something you feel. It's something you've earned through 10,000 repetitions." They ran another mile together, then parted ways at the training facility entrance. Sarah watched the young woman head inside, ready to face another day of grueling training, another day of pushing past limits, another day of becoming something more than she was. And Sarah smiled. Because this was the real victory, not the disarmament in a gas station, not the viral video, not the media attention. The real victory was knowing that somewhere, right now, someone was training, someone was preparing, someone was pushing through exhaustion and doubt and pain because they understood that preparation wasn't about glory. It was about being ready when it mattered most. Sarah thought about the little girl from the gas station who was probably in first grade now, learning to read and write, her life stretching out before her full of possibilities. She thought about Harold, watching his granddaughter walk across a stage in a cap and gown. She thought about Danny, studying criminal justice, building toward a future of service. All those futures existed because on one night, in one moment, Sarah Mitchell had been prepared. And she'd keep preparing, keep training, keep pushing, because somewhere someday there would be another moment, another situation where someone needed help and she was the one who could provide it. That was the oath she'd taken when she'd raised her right hand and sworn to support and defend. That was the commitment she'd made when she'd survived Hell Week. That was the promise she'd kept when she'd disarmed Kyle in that gas station. Heroes, Sarah had learned, weren't born in moments of crisis. They were forged in years of preparation, every cold ocean swim, every painful training session, every moment of choosing not to quit. And as Sarah walked into the training facility for another day of preparing the next generation, she carried with her the most important lesson she'd ever learned. The real story was never about one night in a gas station. It was about every day before it, and every day that would come after. It was about showing up when it was hard, about training when it hurt, about being ready for the worst day of your life so that when it came, and it would come, you'd be prepared. That was the legacy worth building. That was the story worth telling. And Sarah Mitchell was going to spend the rest of her career making sure that story continued. One trainee, one drill, one moment of preparation at a time. Because somewhere out there, someone else would face their own moment of crisis. And if Sarah did her job right, they'd be ready for it. Just like she'd been ready. The end.